I don't think it's time limited. I think they have a very strong understanding of how to effectively project themselves. And of course, they're not operating in a vacuum. They've seen what's happened in Iraq, where there was very sophisticated use made of internet and other media there. They're coming on the back of this and understand that for asymmetric warfare, it's very important for them to project themselves. And they've learnt that lesson very well and will continue to do so. The international community and the Afghan government has been a little more slow to kind of pick up the importance of not just communicating their own objectives, but countering this propaganda. And what we hope that comes out of this report is a greater understanding of some of the issues that need to be addressed.
The report also states that the international community's failure to send in troops in sufficient numbers countrywide as neutral peacekeepers in the early days lies at the root of many of the problems faced in Afghanistan today. Are you referring here to communication problems as well?
No, it's much broader than communication problems. We've been very critical since early 2003, late 2002, of the strategy of sending troops to the relatively safe north and leaving the south, Helmand in particular, free from peacekeepers or from international forces. I think when the British moved in 2006, before then there were perhaps 500 special forces operating in the south. And so it wasn't surprising that the Taliban had an opportunity to establish its roots there, to establish networks, and to make the task of the Afghan government much, much more difficult when it came time to move down south. So the communication side of it is not the substantive part, it's more the actual kind of putting the troop numbers down where they are really required.
There's been a lot of discussion recently that Afghanistan requires a regional approach, and in your report you highlight that some of the production of magazines by the Taliban or for the Taliban, some use of the studios for video content and some control of websites is clearly being done in neighbouring Pakistan. So what are the options for tackling this propaganda when it's actually being disseminated from and controlled and produced in a country other than Afghanistan?
Well, Pakistan is an issue for Afghanistan, and most observers understand this. The fact that Pakistan provides safe havens for the insurgents, that there's the ability for the insurgents to kind of regroup in Pakistan, produce propaganda and use that as a base, makes all their efforts in Afghanistan extremely challenging. And so the international community first has to recognise the scale of the problem. That is happening over the last 12 to 18 months. There has been a dramatic shift, particularly in Washington DC, about the role that Pakistan is playing. The next step then is to work cooperatively with the Pakistan government and make it clear the primacy that the international community places on Pakistan itself dealing with the tribal areas and dealing with the problem of insurgents there. Efforts are being made and much more can be done. The international community can be a lot more coherent in getting its message across to the Pakistan government and supporting its efforts in the tribal areas, the Northwest Frontier Province. And so we would encourage much more of that kind of robust discussion to take place and to demonstrate to Pakistan that it's in its own interest that this be dealt with.
Any civilian casualties in Afghanistan are clearly exploited by the Taliban, yet your report mentions that independent figures shows that anti-government forces killed more than 4 times more civilians in the first 3 months of 2008 than international forces. Do you think this twisted picture is emerging not just because of Taliban propaganda, but also because international forces are not getting their message across clearly?
I mean, this is a big issue. I think, again, it's a substantive issue and not just a communication issue. The communications is critically important at amplifying the message, and often not enough, I suspect, and not having a first-hand insight into the way the communications messages operate, that there is a disconnect between the two. The Taliban has demonstrated very clearly that, in fact, there isn't a disconnect, and they're very quick to respond to these incidents, whereas I think much more of a slow response from the international community. And there needs to be a fundamental understanding. NATO is putting a lot of effort into the communication side of things. It does understand that much more needs to be done. There must be a much greater focus on the Afghan side of the equation, working with the Afghans and strengthening Afghan capacities. So NATO should be focusing not just on the international side of the equation and strengthening its operations, but ensuring that domestically a lot of these issues can be dealt with and responded to.
Would it be fair to say that the average Afghan in the street is not aware of this imbalance?
Yeah, I suspect that is an issue, and I suspect a lot of that comes down to, as I said, Afghan media capacity. I mean, there was an interesting anecdote that we had during the course of this research that that a lot of international journalists for Reuters and so on are accredited to RC South, the base in Kandahar. Afghan journalists aren't. Now, how do you get across your message if the Afghans can't speak to the international forces so that you can be telling them what is going on and about Afghan deaths resulting from Taliban operations? You know, there is a tendency, particularly among internationals, to talk to internationals. And this gets back to the issue that we've talked about needing to train up Afghans, needing to devote more resources to media operations in Afghanistan, which means dealing with, you know, journalists who perhaps don't work like journalists that we are used to working with, and perhaps have not got the sophisticated understanding of the communication message that we might like. But they are the people who are speaking to the Afghan people, and we need to be much more effective at communicating to them.
Your report highlights that tiring out the West and highlighting corruption in Afghanistan are two of the main areas that the Taliban likes to focus on in its propaganda. Which of these two do you feel are more important?
Well, within Afghanistan, it's the corruption and the grievances. You have to understand that, you know, for the Afghan government to establish its legitimacy, it has to persuade the people that it's a credible government that has their best interests at heart. And when there's deep corruption and when there's a cycle of patronage that we see, it resonates very badly with the Afghan people. They have a history. I mean, they have had the last 30 years as a history of a paradigm of power holders, abusive power holders abusing the people. Part of the reason that the Taliban was so successful in its early days back in the 90s was that it was perceived as addressing the corruption and a lot of the patronage that took place. And you have many of the similar drivers happening now. And so there needs to be a better understanding about addressing the substance of these issues, and that's very, very challenging.
How well are the jihadi messages selling in Afghanistan? For example, the Taliban claim that either to kill foreign forces or to be killed fighting them means paradise. But this is obviously a cult of martyrdom that hasn't existed in Afghanistan before. So how well is that message going down there?
From our analysis, these are new messages that are being disseminated perhaps by jihadis who have been active elsewhere. Iraq is the obvious example, but also other conflicts. And that's a very disturbing trend. It also is something that is exacerbated by the activity of the madrasas in the tribal areas that are propagating extremist messages. And this is one of the issues that we think much more effort needs to be focused on countering those messages and countering the substantive issue of the madrasas and the insurgent space in Pakistan.
Finally, what recommendations would you make to troop contributing nations and also for NATO as an international organisation in Afghanistan?
I think the primary message we would give is understand the important role of the Afghan media. As I said, it's very easy for the internationals to focus on the international message, which is very important, but not enough attention. We can do the international side of things better and we have the capability. Not enough attention has been paid to the Afghan side of the equation, developing Afghan talent. I mean, in the end, if you're going to be reaching out to Afghan hearts and minds, it's going to be through the vehicle of the Afghan media. And we need to focus a lot more effort on ensuring that our messages are going through that media much more effectively.
Nick Grono, thank you very much.
Thank you.